He stood there, beneath the indifferent sun, arms raised not in surrender, but in habit, the same motion he'd used thousands of times when called to attention, when called to serve, when saluting a flag that now fluttered behind a bullet-pocked sign reading, "Welcome to Greenridge." He was not a threat. He was a man returning from war. But to the two officers stepping out of the squad car with hands already on their holsters, decorated medals meant nothing next to the color of his skin. His name was Elijah Ward, 53, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 5 tours, and a steel rod in his thigh to remind him that heroism often lives alongside pain. He wasn't home for an hour before his presence became suspicious. Before a neighbor, new to the block and old in fear, whispered 911 into the phone with the urgency of someone who's never seen a battlefield but believes danger has a face. He had come back for his mother's funeral. The casket hadn't even been lowered when the cruiser rolled up outside her house, the same house he'd grown up in, the same porch he'd kissed her goodbye on before shipping out in 2003. But now it looked different, smaller, like grief had shrunk its bones, or maybe the house knew what was coming. The first officer barked a question before Elijah could turn around. The second shouted a command before the first answer came. Elijah reached for his ID, slow, deliberate, trained, but the world doesn't slow for black men in moments like these. Not even for soldiers, not even for silence. One shot cracked the morning like a dropped mirror, then another, and another. He didn't fall, not at first. He stumbled back, confused, not because he didn't understand pain, but because the betrayal was surgical, familiar, like war had followed him home. The neighbors didn't rush out. The neighborhood stayed still. Only the wind moved, lifting the edges of a crumpled American flag that had fallen to the pavement. The officers didn't check for a pulse. They radioed in a situation. One paced. One holstered his weapon like he was returning it to a drawer. A child 2 houses down peered through blinds and saw a man bleeding in his Sunday suit. She didn't know what medals meant, but she knew her father always stood when the national anthem played, and now this man couldn't stand at all. They didn't know who he was yet, but they would. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later, too late to stop the bleeding, but just in time to witness the unraveling. Elijah was still breathing, barely. The paramedics moved fast, eyes darting from the badge numbers to the slow, pooling red beneath him. One of them whispered something under his breath. The other didn't speak at all, only clenched his jaw as if chewing the bitterness of restraint. There was a quiet understanding that this wasn't just another call. This was a reckoning in uniform. The officers stood off to the side, rehearsing their story without speaking it out loud. It hung between them, taut and ready. He reached for something. The oldest lie, freshly painted. Elijah's phone had hit the sidewalk during the chaos. Screen cracked but still lit. A message unsent, typed with shaking hands minutes before the shooting. Made it back. Doesn't feel like home anymore. By afternoon, the hospital was on lockdown. Press already sniffed the air. Someone leaked the bodycam footage before the department could edit it into compliance. Raw, uncut, undeniable, the footage showed a man complying, breathing, bleeding, never armed. It traveled faster than silence, faster than fear. It landed in inboxes in Washington, at a desk with a seal that carried weight. At the Pentagon, someone stared too long at the name. Elijah Ward. They pulled up his file, and then they stood. The next hour unfolded with grim purpose. Calls made. Names spoken with tight throats. A retired general who once owed Elijah his life picked up the phone. He didn't ask questions. He made one call, and then another. Power moved behind closed doors with the quiet rage of men who had buried too many brothers in desert heat, only to watch one be nearly killed on American soil for looking like a question. At Greenridge PD, Captain Rusk tried to stay ahead of the wave. Routine check, he told the press. Noncompliance, he said to the mayor, but the tide had already turned. They didn't know, not really, who Elijah was, but they would. Back in the hospital room, Elijah drifted in and out of consciousness, tethered to machines, heart fighting a quiet war. The nurses whispered around him. One had a cousin in Fallujah, said she recognized the tattoo on his shoulder, the 5th Special Forces Group. They shot a damn legend, she murmured. Outside, the sky remained clear. It was still daytime, but the light no longer felt innocent. By the next morning, the town of Greenridge was no longer a quiet speck on the map. News vans lined the curb like vultures in chrome. feeding cables into satellite dishes while anchors rehearsed empathy in front of cameras. Behind them, the house Elijah grew up in stood sealed and somber, its windows like shut eyes refusing to witness the madness unfolding again on its lawn. The footage had gone global. It didn't matter that the Pentagon hadn't made an official statement yet. The story had cracked something deeper, not just outrage, but recognition. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about all the salutes returned with bullets, all the wars survived only to be hunted in peace. In a Pentagon briefing room lined with portraits of solemn men in brass and ribbons, the Secretary of Defense watched the footage for the third time. No one spoke, not even the aides. The silence wasn't out of respect, it was out of shame. Elijah had served with distinction across 2 decades, volunteered for the missions no one wanted, trained men half his age, buried friends in lands without names, and now he was fighting for breath in the country he'd fought for. They authorized a military liaison to fly to Greenridge that afternoon, not to calm the town, to witness it, to make it clear that this man mattered, that his service came with a ledger, and someone would now collect. Meanwhile, Officer Brent Keller sat in a dim room 2 floors below the Greenridge precinct, staring at a blinking light on a recorder. His hands were steady. He believed he'd followed protocol. He always believed that. His partner, Officer Drew Salinsky, was pacing, sweat soaking through the underarms of his shirt. "Did you see a gun?" the investigator asked, voice dry. Keller blinked. "No. But you said he was reaching for his wallet." "Yeah, that's what it looked like. That's not a weapon." Keller looked away, jaw tightening. "I didn't have time to think." The investigator scribbled nothing, just stared. That's the problem. Outside, the community was gathering, not in chaos, in ritual. Veterans from surrounding counties rolled in on motorcycles and aging pickup trucks, wearing faded uniforms and medals polished for the first time in years. They stood at attention outside the hospital, saluting nothing, saying everything. Black, white, brown. Men who had once crawled through the same dust with Elijah now stood guard as if war had followed them here too. A boy holding a cardboard sign read, "My dad fought with him. You shot a hero." Inside the ICU, Elijah's fingers twitched. The machines kept time, and somewhere deep in the bureaucracy, consequences were being borne. Officer Keller was suspended by noon, not placed on leave, not reassigned. Suspended pending federal investigation, a phrase that landed like a dropped gavel in the police union office and spread like blood on linen. The department scrambled to contain the breach, but containment was no longer an option. Not when every screen, every voice, every headline now bore the same name. Elijah Ward, decorated, betrayed, surviving, at the hospital, his condition had stabilized. The bullets had torn through soft tissue, not bone, though one had come within a whisper of his spine. The surgeon called it providence. The nurse called it a miracle. Elijah hadn't spoken yet, not a word, but when they lifted his hand, he gripped back, firm, defiant, present. The Pentagon liaison arrived just before visiting hours. Colonel Anita Griggs, tall, iron-backed, her face carved by 20 years of command and disappointment. She did not come with a press statement. She came with a folder, and silence. She walked past the crowd without speaking, but nodded once to the veterans standing vigil. They saluted her. She returned it. Inside the hospital room, she sat beside Elijah's bed and opened the folder slowly. Commendations, deployment records, letters of valor. She laid them out on the tray before him, as if reintroducing a man to his own name. "You're not forgotten, Sergeant Major," she said softly, "and you sure as hell aren't invisible." He turned his head, slow and heavy, and looked at her. His eyes weren't wounded. They were focused, quietly burning. Outside, the pressure mounted. Protests began that afternoon, not just in Greenridge, but in 4 other cities. The footage had become emblematic. Veterans chained wheelchairs to courthouse gates. Active duty soldiers posted videos refusing to be silent. "We don't serve 2 Americas," one Marine captain said on camera. "We don't fight for a flag that forgets us." Meanwhile, Officer Salinsky turned himself in, without warning. Without ceremony, he walked into the precinct, removed his badge, and placed it on the desk. His hands trembled. He did not speak. Later that night, leaked audio would reveal the words he muttered on his way out. "We shot a man who saluted me before I aimed my weapon." The Greenridge mayor, under pressure from both Washington and the streets, convened an emergency session. Bodycam footage was made fully public. Internal Affairs launched criminal proceedings, and for the first time in that department's history, a police shooting would not be handled internally. The tide had shifted, but for Elijah, Lying under the hum of fluorescent lights, the world still moved in slow fragments. He blinked once, and then again. And finally he whispered, "Call my unit." They came the next morning, quiet, disciplined, 5 men and 2 women, all former special forces, each carrying their own war behind the eyes. They didn't wear uniforms, not officially, but they walked like soldiers, stood like monuments. Their presence didn't shout, it whispered power. The hospital administrator tried to limit access. Colonel Griggs overruled him with a signature and a stare. They entered Elijah's room one by one, no words, just nods, salutes, hands placed gently on the edge of the bed like a promise. These weren't just comrades, they were family, the kind forged in fire, not blood. Elijah met each gaze, no tears, just the silence of men who have buried too many friends and seen too many folded flags. Then, slowly, he gestured toward the tray beside him, where Griggs had laid his medals the day before. The youngest of them, Ramirez, picked up the bronze star and pinned it to Elijah's hospital gown without a word. "We don't let our own fall," said Harris, the eldest, voice low and ragged. Outside, the media began to change its tone. Not just another police shooting. Not just another black man misjudged, mistreated, nearly murdered. This was different. This was a soldier, a decorated veteran, a hero in uniform turned suspect in civilian skin. A moral dissonance the nation could no longer hum through. The trial date was fast, tracked. Federal oversight kicked in. Officer Keller was charged with assault with a deadly weapon under color of authority. The phrase sounded clinical, antiseptic, but in the courthouse lobby, a poster hung from the ceiling in bold black font. "Hero shot for coming home." In the weeks that followed, Elijah regained his voice fully. He didn't speak to the press, he didn't issue statements, but he did request one thing from Colonel Griggs: "I want to walk into that courtroom on my own feet." She didn't ask why, she already knew. When the day arrived, the sun was punishing, and the courthouse steps gleamed under its weight. Crowds gathered. Veterans from every war since Vietnam lined the sidewalks in dress blues and camo, medals pinned, backs straight, and then he appeared, Elijah Ward, Sergeant Major, alive, no wheelchair, no escort. Each step down the hospital ramp cost him pain, but he took it anyway, cane in hand, dignity unbroken. The crowd parted. The silence was sacred. Someone began to hum the national anthem, slow and low. Not in pride, in mourning, he stopped at the courthouse door, turned to face the crowd, and saluted. The gesture was simple, but it shattered something old and rotten in the American mythos. Then he walked inside. The courtroom was cold, not by accident, cold like control. Cold like sterilization, as if justice could only be dispensed in climates where emotion froze and truth moved at the pace of procedure. But Elijah's presence brought heat. He sat upright, every movement deliberate, pain hidden beneath posture. On his right sat Colonel Griggs. On his left, a young civil rights attorney named Meyer Ellison, brilliant, relentless, and unafraid to look a badge in the eye and call it out by name. Officer Keller entered from the other side, flanked by 2 attorneys in pressed suits. He didn't look at Elijah, not once, not even when the judge entered, not even when the charges were read aloud. The prosecutor began with the footage, again. As if it hadn't been seen 1,000 times, but in the courtroom silence made it new. The gunshots still echoed, the gasp of a neighbor, the impact of body against ground, and then the stillness. Then came the testimony. The paramedic, first to reach Elijah, spoke plainly. There was no weapon, just a wallet, a military ID, blood, and disbelief. The nurse, voice trembling, recalled the moment she realized the man she was treating had saved more lives overseas than the officers who shot him had ever protected here at home. Maya stood next, calm and precise. This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. This is a case of inherited fear, of training that teaches threat over humanity, of skin as suspicion. She paused, letting the room breathe. Elijah Ward survived 5 tours of combat, but the war that almost killed him came dressed as law. That is the enemy we are here to confront. On the 3rd day, Elijah took the stand. The room shifted. Reporters stopped typing. The judge leaned forward. Even Keller glanced up. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I followed every command," he said. "I announced my movement. I held my hands visible. I did everything I was trained to do, by the same country that taught them to see me as less." He paused, breathing shallow but steady. "I buried friends for this nation. I wore its uniform, bled for its cause. But the second I came home in black skin, none of that mattered." He turned toward Keller, not with rage, but with something colder. "You didn't see a man that day. You saw a silhouette, and you shot it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reckoning. In the jury box, something shifted. In the gallery, a woman wept. Outside, the sun continued to shine, unblinking, on a nation being forced to stare into its own reflection. Verdict day came like a storm with no thunder, no cries, no chants, just the murmur of gathered breath and restless hearts waiting for a scale to tilt. The courtroom was packed, not just with press or legal observers, but with people who'd never trusted justice to show up at all. Veterans in full dress, mothers with photographs in their purses, children too young to understand law, but old enough to understand pain. The jury filed. In, 12 faces carved in stone, no glances, no tremble, the foreman stood. Guilty, he said, on all counts. The gavel struck, final, echoing. Keller didn't move. His attorneys did, startled, fumbling, but the weight had already collapsed on him, a consequence not just of bullets fired, but of belief systems collapsing. Behind him, a woman, his sister maybe, or wife, let out a broken sigh that tried to sound like protest, but fell into silence. Even she knew. Elijah remained still. He didn't flinch, didn't celebrate, just closed his eyes for a moment, as if filing the verdict beside every memory of war, every comrade buried, every salute ever returned without suspicion. The sentence would come later. But the real punishment had already landed, a badge stripped of immunity, a uniform unmasked, a story that could no longer be rewritten to fit the lie of just doing my job. Outside, a line of motorcyclists revved their engines once, then stopped, not a noise in tribute. Each bike bore a flag, some American, some POW. One hand stitched bore only Elijah's name. That night, President Langford issued a statement. There are moments in our history where silence becomes complicity. Today, we speak not only to honor a man, but to confront the system that nearly erased him. But Elijah didn't watch it. He sat on the edge of his hospital bed, now relocated to a rehabilitation center in Virginia, and stared out the window at a tree swaying gently in the evening wind. His cane rested beside him. His medals were gone from the tray. He'd asked them to be boxed away. "Don't want them looking at me like I'm just a victim," he told the nurse earlier. "I'm still a soldier. Just fighting a different war now." He wasn't bitter, not anymore. Bitterness is a wound that never clots. Elijah had passed that phase. What lived in him now was something deeper, sharper, purpose. The next morning, he would begin speaking to young officers at the academy. A quiet program started by veterans, meant to teach future cops what no textbook ever could, what it means to see humanity before suspicion. But for now, in the soft breath of evening, he simply sat, breathing, still here, still fighting. The classroom was sterile, government-issued gray walls, dim lights, desks arranged with clinical precision. But Elijah brought something into it that no policy manual could offer. Presence, wounded but unbroken, still standing, though slower now. His cane echoed softly with every step toward the lectern, a rhythm of resilience that made even the boldest recruits sit straighter. They didn't know what to expect. Some had seen the footage. Others had read about him in headlines or caught glimpses of interviews they hadn't cared enough to finish. But now, faced with the living man, they were quiet, not with guilt, with recognition. A few shifted in their seats, eyes locked forward, unsure whether they were here to be scolded or enlightened. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't soften his tone. "I'm not here to lecture," he began, voice rough as gravel, steady as steel. "I'm here because I don't want to be shot again." He let that sit. "I don't want any of you to pull a trigger in fear you were trained to carry, instead of wisdom you were never taught." He paced slowly. "You've been handed a weapon and told you're the good guy. But no one ever asked if you knew how to tell the difference between threat and trauma, between a gesture and a goodbye." A young cadet raised a hand, bold, curious. "Sir, were you afraid?" Elijah turned, locked eyes. "No, I was betrayed." The words fell heavy, final. In the days that followed, his presence became a quiet force. Not just in training rooms, but in courtrooms on panels, in town halls where mothers wept and mayors promised. He became more than a survivor. He became a mirror, not of pain, but of possibility. A reminder that healing doesn't come from punishment alone, but from transformation. Meanwhile, Keller's sentence came down hard. 12 years, no early parole, no shield. He wept as the cuffs clicked shut, not because he was leaving his life behind, but because the system that once protected him had finally refused. For the first time, it treated him not as a brother in blue, but as a man accountable. Elijah didn't attend the sentencing. He was at his mother's grave alone, kneeling, apologizing. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," he whispered, brushing dead leaves from the headstone. "But I'm home now, and I see things clear." The wind answered softly, rustling the branches above. He placed his old uniform cap on the headstone, let it rest. He would never wear it again, but he would carry what it meant. Word of Elijah's story echoed far beyond Greenridge. It threaded itself into morning talk shows and Sunday sermons, college lectures and campaign trails. But it wasn't the politics people remembered. It was the image, a soldier saluting the courthouse after surviving his own country's bullet. That silent gesture, captured in a single still frame, became a symbol, not of victory, but of refusal. A refusal to disappear, a refusal to die quietly. Congress invited him to testify. He declined, not out of protest but principle. Truth doesn't need applause, he told a reporter. It just needs to be seen, and if they haven't seen it by now, my words won't change that. Instead, he poured himself into the academy program, rebuilt it from the bones up, real-world training. De-escalation tactics rooted in psychology, not paranoia. Community immersion exercises where cadets listened to the stories of the people they were meant to protect, not to question them, but to understand them. He gave no speeches. He offered stories, the kind only those who have been hunted while wearing the uniform of the hunter can tell. Meanwhile, across the country, other veterans began to speak. Black and brown soldiers, long silent, began sharing their own versions of homecomings that felt more like interrogations, stops that turned into searches, questions that turned into guns. Each story carried the same echo. Service doesn't bleach skin. Dignity shouldn't depend on proximity to power. Elijah became the reluctant nexus of a movement he didn't ask for. Not a leader, not a martyr, just a man who refused to lie down. Politicians called. Some wanted endorsements, others wanted silence. He gave neither. One night, a package arrived at his door. No return address. Inside, a folded American flag, a note. We failed you, but not again. 5th SFG retired. He held the flag for a long time, not as a symbol, but as a wound stitched with thread. At a small ceremony months later, he unveiled a plaque at the academy. It bore no names, no medals, just a single inscription. Courage is not pulling the trigger, it's pausing long enough to see the man. He didn't speak at the unveiling. He just stood there, cane at his side, eyes level with the crowd, and for once the silence didn't feel like violence. It felt like reverence. Time, as it always does, began to smooth the edges. The media moved on. The protests quieted. The headlines shifted to newer tragedies, fresher wounds. But in Greenridge, and in the hearts of those who remembered, Elijah Ward remained a quiet current beneath it all, a steady undertow of truth that couldn't be drowned by distraction. He bought back his childhood home, not out of sentiment, but defiance. The same porch where he'd once been gunned down now bore fresh paint and a brass plate beside the door. Ward House. No fanfare, no visitors. Just a man and a home rebuilt from ruins. The neighbor who had called the police still lived next door. She never came to apologize, never even looked him in the eye. But once, late at night, he found a tin of fresh cornbread on his stoop. No note, just warmth wrapped in foil. He didn't eat it, but he didn't throw it away. Either in the mornings he sat on that porch and watched the sun climb across a town that now saw him, not just as the man in the story, but as a neighbor, a teacher, a veteran, a survivor. Sometimes young officers would stop by after their shifts. No badges, just questions. They sat on the steps and asked about the wars, not the ones overseas, but the ones here, the slow ones. The ones you fight with patience instead of firepower. Elijah always answered. One day, a teenage girl walked up the path. She held a sketchpad to her chest and wore a shy kind of courage in her eyes. "Mr. Ward," she said, "I drew something for you." He invited her onto the porch. She opened the pad. Inside, a charcoal drawing of Elijah standing tall, his silhouette wrapped not in camouflage, but in a cloak made of newspaper headlines, his face solemn, hand raised in a salute not to a flag, but to a mirror. He studied it for a long time. "What do you see?" she asked, quiet. He smiled, a rare, tired smile. "I see a man who finally came home." The wind picked up, rustling the trees, lifting the corner of the drawing as if even the air wanted to hold part of his story. And there, in the daylight, beneath a sky that still belonged to all of them, Elijah Ward remained, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a question that refused to fade. What kind of country salutes its soldiers abroad, but fears their skin at home? The answer, now, could no longer hide.